All right, we are back for video 2 on the Formula of Concord. We're going to, in this video, talk about the controversies that are arising. Now, Scott, there's a lot of articles and controversies are stated, but there's sort of bigger controversies that then they use like these theological categories to address, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the reality is that we might, because of Facebook and whatnot, have a concept of it, but a concept of how fraught with controversy this time is. We often look at sort of the good old days as if, that they didn't deal with the same things that we deal with. But the reality is that they did. They didn't use social media. Well, they used their form of social media, which is essentially publishing booklets and posters and that type of thing, and preaching, honestly, and lecturing, and these controversies were, I think it's accurate to say they were ripping the public Lutheran faith in pieces.
And this is sort of a newer thing, this ability to have public controversies this way because of how easy it was to publish stuff and to mass produce things and then get it into the hands of people, right? I mean, it's not been that long since the invention of the printing press and people having that readily available to them. So, before this time, a controversy, it would have to get spread one person to another, kind of. It wasn't like, you were sitting there handing out all these pamphlets with these, with different opinions on theological topics. So they're sort of dealing with a newish problem, this sort of viral theological opinions.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn between this time and our time. I mean, media is not new to us. Social media is not even new to us anymore. But how easy it is to promote bad ideas via social media is something that we still struggle with. Look at in the United States, the controversy over Russian meddling in U.S. elections was primarily a controversy over fake news put over social media and people buying it. And they're dealing with a lot of the same thing. I mean, there's publishers in a lot of the towns now. And so if you're a local theologian in a town, you can write something that can get published and then distributed fairly widely. But even a lot of these controversies that we'll talk about are happening with theologians within Wittenberg. I mean, it's kind of interesting. So, or that are quote unquote Wittenburgers, people trained at Wittenberg.
So people from the same school, from the same sort of tribe, quote unquote, that even within are taking different stances and it's aggressive. I mean, like one of the things that you see when you look at some of the ways that people engage in debate back then at this time, they don't hold anything back, man. I mean, I mean, it's pretty brutal. And I think for a lot of people who start to look at, say, maybe the greatest example, Luther's bondage of the will and his response to Erasmus. I mean, the way that he will insult Erasmus is, I mean, it's one for the ages, but that was not abnormal.
No, it's funny. It's interesting you brought that up because Melanchthon, the guy we talked about in the last show a little bit, Luther's primary counterpart at the University of Wittenberg, was a good friend of Erasmus. And it's often said that Melanchthon disagrees with the bondage of the will, meaning that Melanchthon doesn't agree with the doctrine in the bondage of the will, which is, I think, for the most part, patently false. There are parts in there where he would say that Luther leaned more towards what's called Manichaean determinism than others. But at the same time, what Melanchthon was very upset with Luther about from the bondage of the will was the way he talked to Erasmus.
It was the tone, the contemptuous disrespect.
He thought Erasmus was worthy of much more respect than Luther gave him.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's interesting, Lutherans, Erasmus is sort of this, sort of a bad guy in a lot of Lutherans' minds, but
and Reformed for that matter, Lutheran and Reformed both. Yeah.
But before this time, I mean, Erasmus played a huge role. In the Reformation and the
I mean, you could say, in some ways, I've often thought about writing, and people have done it though, writing an article called Erasmus, the First Reformer, because in a lot of ways he He was. He wanted the reform of the church. He didn't want to leave the church at any cost, but he wanted the reform of the church. He was looking for more of a moral reform, and
Sure.
and when you read his little treatise on the freedom of the will, you very much see that. In fact, he argues to Luther that if we tell people that they're, if we treat them this way and tell them that God is doing all the work and that they don't have to, that then there'll be moral chaos.
Right.
Unless there's something to hold over their head, i.e. their salvation. Luther, it's funny, if you read the introduction to the Bondage of the Will, you at the very beginning, you get Luther's commending of Erasmus for getting to the heart of the matter.
Right.
It literally states, no one else has understood the heart of the matter but you, O Erasmus. And but then
he just goes on to assault him.
A little bit of credit. He literally calls him stupid multiple times.
Yeah.
Which Erasmus certainly is not.
He was not stupid. No, I mean, Luther's translation of the Bible was dependent in whole, especially the New Testament translation, on Erasmus's fairly newly published critical edition of the New Testament.
Yeah, I was going to say. Erasmus' translation work is invaluable to the Reformation.
Well, his in that case, it's his sort of scholarly collecting of primary documents of the New Testament, and then sort of critically analyzing which are the best and which are not. And I mean, that's incredible work. And any pastor who's gone to seminary and has a Nestle Aland critical edition of the New Testament and can make their way through the critical notes at the bottom will be, astounded at somebody that on their own in the 1500s could put together something like that.
Yeah.
He got in a lot of trouble for that too, by the way.
Yeah.
With the church.
So all that to say, I mean, that's just a small example of the kind of way that people would engage in debate over theological issues, and that didn't cease after Luther's death when these various Lutheran theologians and pastors are discussing issues. It's getting brutal, and so division is necessarily taking place in this time.
Well, some of this, Scott, goes back to what you were talking about, where in the last video where you talked about Melanchthon sort of not being able to wear that crown. And part of this is just sort of the personality and makeup of Luther, right? So the things that we would look at as maybe flaws in him, also it kind of make him the kind of person that can wear that crown. He's so dogmatic.
These days, we might say he's an alpha male kind of guy.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's not that Melanchthon isn't described with some of those same sort of. Melanchthon was somewhat known in his classroom for having a fiery temper. You did not want to go to Melanchthon's class without doing the assigned reading. But just publicly, his public persona was not such that he was the leader of a movement.
Right.
He just wasn't.
Yeah, and Melanchthon is much more careful than Luther, right?
I don't know if you know any academics.
Yeah.
They're not leaders of movements. Luther is a pastor, a monk turned pastor, turned priest, turned pastor, turned scholar. Melanchthon is an academic, period. From the time he's 12 years old, he is studying to be the next Erasmus.
Even the way that Luther does scholarship, it never ceases being pastoral. Like it's always with the parishioner, with the flock in mind that he's writing. So even if he's doing high theology or whatnot, it's never divorced from the person sitting in the pew.
No, and whereas Melanchthon, more I think could be argued, is usually writing to train the pastor. And so more clarity, more playing with the edges to make sure that you can turn them from soft little corners to the pointy end of the stick. Whereas Luther is always worried about the other person that is wrestling with a terrified conscience as he is. Now Melanchthon does that quite a bit, but he does it from the perspective of trying to teach the pastor how to teach to reconcile the terrified conscience, whereas Melanchthon's usually going right at the terrified conscience.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are some of the controversies that we're dealing with here, Scott? I mean, I don't know if you want to sort of do them in a certain order or whatnot, but why don't we dig into that?
let's start with the big one. The big one that's causing a lot of fracture in the church after 1548, when so we said in the last show that there was the Smalcaldic War, right? And the Holy Roman Empire takes out, pastors are, some are killed, some are just put under the thumb, some run away. There was an attempt by the people who were working with the Roman Catholic Church to produce some documents that might bring some peace at that time, and would be like compromise documents. And those are called the interims, or the Augsburg and the Leipzig interims. And these interims reintroduce what the hardcore Lutherans would call Romish practices back in. Most of these having to do with bringing in more of the sort of high church practices that were abandoned by the Lutherans, and specifically some of the practices that are seen as theologically bad. The sacrificing of the Mass during the supper, and then teachings on transubstantiation and things like that. So, I mean, I don't know how much detail we want to get on that, but I think it's suffice to say they're bringing in practices which were more aligned with Rome's doctrine than with Lutheran doctrine. And it produces a controversy that's answered in Article 10 of the Formula of Concord called the Adioaphoristic Controversy. And that word simply means indifferent. And it's trying to answer what type of practice. This is like whether we stand up or sit down, whether we, I don't know, face the congregation during consecrating the elements, or face the table during the consecration of the elements. Things down to that detail, right? Which of those are indifferent and just a matter of our particular tradition, and which of those are not indifferent and are thereby mandated that we must do them this way. And there's two sides to this, right? There's the people that really were on the side of the interims as bringing peace to this fractured land. And then there's the side of a group that became known as Gnesios, or authentic Lutherans. I'll say it's somewhat inaccurate for the trolls, and I know that, but I'll say led by Matthias Flacius, or Flacius. And Flacius had a line that really illustrates how strongly he thought that Lutherans should not give up any practices they abandoned. And his reasoning is that if we abandon, we didn't see Lutherans, unlike other reformational churches, didn't just outright abandon practices and didn't tear down statues and paintings, and that we didn't do that on the whole.
Because Lutherans were seeking as much continuity as possible. It wasn't sort of revolt, it was reformation.
We were magisterial, right? We understood that there's still an authority there. And we left a lot of the practices in place, but if we abandon a practice, there's usually a theological reason for abandoning it. And this is what Flacius is acknowledging. And he says this, he goes, nothing is an adiaphoron, or nothing is indifferent, right? In the case of confession and offense. In other words, because there was an interim that they were being told they had to subscribe to during a time of oppression, he's saying, if you're making me do it, you're not acknowledging the indifferent status of this thing, and thus it's not indifferent to me either, and I have to oppose doing it. So Romanish practice comes in. It to Flacius, just on any given day, it may or may not be an indifferent thing. In our context, when I teach this, I say kind of think of the difference between liturgical and contemporary worship as being sort of a classic adiaphoron, or indifferent thing. Your church may do a contemporary service that is very in line with Scripture, that is very reverential to God, that acknowledges God as the doer and we as the supplicant, and that acknowledges that is very scriptural and all that, but it just uses guitars and drums and a more upbeat whatever. And then you may do a very traditional liturgical service, and in normal times, either one of those it's pretty indifferent, right? Both of those things can be done by the church and can serve the parishioners and be proper ways of preaching to the parishioners the love of God on account of Christ to them. he's saying in a time of oppression, if you tell me I have to do contemporary worship, I can no longer, even if I wanted to, do contemporary worship. It's no longer indifferent. It's called Instatio Confessionis. It's I stand in a confession against it. And the writers of the Formula of Concord, they answer this in Article 10, and we'll go through that. But the Article 10, I'd say for the most part, acknowledges Flacius's position as the more accurate of the two. They never really fall completely in with Flacius because he makes a pretty big error later on, but they acknowledge that in a time of oppression, even things that would be indifferent are no longer indifferent.
Yeah.
So this becomes a major factor this becomes a major issue that we'll see when we get to Article 10 here.
Yeah, and it's splitting the church of their time. I mean, the Gnesios versus what are sometimes called the intermists, sometimes even called the Philippists, because late in the interim process, Melanchthon participates in the writing of one of the interim documents, and his followers so go along with it. He later, to Flacius, acknowledges his error in that matter. Flacius doesn't care, though.
Yeah.
I've had this discussion with Wade Johnson, who writes for 1517, who's a Flacius scholar, and we did a Let the Bird Fly podcast on Melanchthon and Flacius, which was a lot of fun. And I had to acknowledge that Flacius is right about a lot of what he taught, as opposed to Melanchthon's position, but he was just such a jerk. I almost said
Good save.
Yeah. I mean, really, Jiminy Christmas.
So that's a big controversy that's taking place within the church.
Yeah.
What are some of the other controversies that are going on?
So another one that's answered in Article 4 on good works is the Majoristic Controversy. So there's a man named George Major who is defending incorrectly a statement by Melanchthon in Melanchthon's 1535 systematic theology called the Loci Communes, where Melanchthon says good works are necessary to salvation. I know a little bit about this topic.
I know you do.
Yeah.
Because on his face, that statement seems like something that a Lutheran would immediately reject.
Yeah, right, correct, and rightly so. So Major takes that and he runs with it, right? And so he sort of creates this whole theology around the idea that good works are necessary to salvation. Not what Melanchthon intended in the 1535 Loci. Melanchthon is using an Aristotelian category that it's not clear that George Major understood, whereas he says sort of the result of being saved is that God will produce good works in you. But whatever, Major doesn't get it. He runs with it. Lutherans stand up against it. The guy that stands up dramatically against it is a pastor named Amsdorf, who goes on to preach that pastors should never preach on good works and should never preach the law to their parishioners, because Christians are saved and they don't need the law anymore. And it's basically you got these two guys that are just running around polar opposites.
Yeah.
This controversy starts pretty early, and the only reason it's addressed in the Article 4 of the Formula of Concord is because it just doesn't go away. Like Luther tried to answer this controversy by writing the Small Catechism, for Pete's sake. I mean, there's a good argument to be made that Luther wrote the Small Catechism to answer Amsdorf's claim that, or at least you could say this, at least wrote the explanation of the Ten Commandments in the Small Catechism in an effort to show Amsdorf a way in which the law taught to faithful Christians is very useful and worthy. And it's still being argued.
So this controversy is addressed in the article on good works, the article on law and gospel, the article on the third use. All of this is that. So that this is what I was saying at the beginning, that you have all these controversies sort of baked into this document, and then you might actually even reference more than one of them in any particular article.
Right.
So it's sort of clearing up everything.
Yeah.
It's actually a pretty clever way to do it, right? As opposed to just here's the controversy and then writing this whole thing saying, well, here's the doctrines that we believe and how these doctrines might affirm or recant or renounce these particular errors. And a lot of these errors touch different points of doctrine.
Yeah.
Not just one.
Yep. Yeah. So, and then they do that all along. I mean, anytime the formula or any other part of the Lutheran confessions teach that if you are saved, it's on account of Christ alone, by the grace of God alone, it flies in the face of George Major. Anytime one of the Lutheran confessions teaches that the law still serves as a useful teacher to the Christian, it's going to fly in the face of the teaching of Amsdorf. You know, and so we have to see these things in complete pictures. That's why in our day and age, when these sort of battles erupt on social media, 150 words at a time, where people assume that they understand a person's complete theology based on one sentence that they said in a blog or on a podcast or something without coming into conversation with them. We're just falling into that same error again.
Right.
This is, someone can say that I'm an antinomian and then listen to a talk that I give at a Christ Whole Fast City event and think that I'm a pronomian or whatever. It's like, there's a complete picture here that has to be acknowledged. And this is what the formula tries to do.
Yeah.
Formula is trying to summarize this stuff so that you can give a clear, concise answer to the problem.
Yep.
Yeah. I kind of love how the way they went about it, where, for instance, if you take the third use article, it doesn't come out and say necessarily like we stand with this guy. Instead, it says this is what we believe.
Yeah,
and then you extrapolate from that where each of these people may or people involved in these controversies may or may not be wrong. Because as you were saying, like there might be instances where you don't want to just outright renounce a guy because not everything that he's saying is untrue. So you're chipping away at the errors by making a positive statement of this is what we believe. Now, of course, there's also they renounce certain things as well, but it's not just as simple as, okay, now we're going to write a thing about Major and we're going to tell you why he's wrong about everything.
Well, and there's a certain tactical wisdom to that too, right? Because then you avoid the sort of tribalism that comes around a guy that happens to be your buddy that you need to defend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So is there what else are we looking at? We got a couple minutes here.
Well, let me fly through just two more, and we'll sort of let the other ones sort of rest a little bit. Two more kind of big ones that are addressed here. The synergistic controversy. Synergism is the idea that we have to cooperate with God in our own salvation. There are some people running around teaching, again, based on a statement in Melanchthon's 1535 Loci, where he says that man's will participates in his conversion, in that it accepts the grace of God. And they run around saying, see, even Melanchthon teaches that you have to cooperate in your salvation. Melanchthon since has gone, well, that's not what I said at all. Again, he's using an Aristotelian category that people just don't understand. But still, it persists, even as he sort of denies it, and it's answered pretty firmly in Article 2 on free will in the formula, which relies heavily on ideas that Luther brought to us in his great work, The Bondage of the Will. So even in the introduction to the Formula of Concord, it's acknowledged in the Book of Concord, that the bondage of the will as a document didn't make it into the Book of Concord, but that it was heavily relied upon and it was faithfully trusted by formulators. The other one is the Flacian controversy. This is Matthias Flacius again, as he sort of opposes this idea of the man can participate in his salvation. He basically ends up again using Aristotle to say that being a sinner, being born into original sin, or being a sinner is of the substance of a man. And people who understood Aristotle came out and said, "Oh, that can't be, because God, after He created us, said." This is good. And then Christ became a man. So the substance of a man can't be that a man is a sinner. It has to be it has to be something else. And the else is it's a depravity. It's a derivation. It's a change. It's a changing the substance of a man into something it was never intended to be. Some would say an accident. When I talked to Wade about that, he said, an accident sort of implies that it's like dirt that you got on your jacket that you can brush off. And he said, our teaching isn't that. It's a much deeper problem than dirt that you have to brush off your jacket. It's just acknowledged it's not part of the substance. The one that we were referring to earlier, Dan, the antinomian controversy, we'll get into that, but it's answered in Article 5 and 6 on law and gospel, where it gets into the third function of the law. And this is, again, the idea of Amsdorff being brought up again, that the law doesn't need to be taught to Christians because Christians are already saved, and the law no longer holds power over them. And that's answered in Article 5 and 6. There are a couple really funny ones. One of them is you'll see in Article 9 a one-sentence article on Christ's descent into hell.
Right.
Acknowledging that Christ did descend into hell. And this is against a teaching of a guy, Epineus, in Hamburg, who's running around saying this wasn't the case. This was basically put in to defend Luther's position on this, to be honest with you. Because it's not like it wasn't in debate, and it wasn't like the debate was unfounded. It was just that Luther held pretty firmly that Christ descended into hell, and the scriptures teach it. And so it was put in the formula. So
yeah, that's a debate that still is up today. I mean, and in some cases not debated, because there's certain church bodies that have removed that line from the creed even. And
yeah.
so I've attended churches before where that line is just absent. And so I think I've brought this up with people before, I've been at church and where that line is present, and then have people come and say, whoa, what is that? I never heard that before, so to say the controversy still goes on maybe isn't even the right word, because in some cases it's not even a controversy, because there's a ton of Christians that don't even know that there's Christians that believe that.
Yeah, that's correct. The last one we should talk about be Article 11 on eternal foreknowledge and election. There's a guy running around Strasbourg who's ostensibly a Lutheran, but probably what's called a crypto-Calvinist. In other words, a Calvinized Lutheran, maybe you might want to say, teaching that once a Christian had faith, that faith could never be lost. So if you are a Calvinist and you hold the tulip, it's that P, that perseverance of the saints, once saved, always saved kind of thing. And so the Formula of Concord in Article 11 goes on to teach the difference between foreknowledge and election and what those two things mean. Great article. Again, relies heavily on Martin Luther's The Bondage of the Will. I feel like we missed one, probably the Osiandrin controversy, but we can do it as we go through them.
Yeah, great. All right, guys. Well, next video we will get into original sin. Good times.